Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
If you'll all take your seats, we'll be getting started. The library does close at 8:30 promptly, so we do want not to lose any time at the beginning here. I'm Mary Hewson-Callan, President of the League of Women Voters of the Rochester metro area. The League is pleased to join with the Rochester People's Climate Coalition in co-sponsoring this debate between the candidates for mayor in the Democratic primary election. The League is nonpartisan, which means we do not endorse political campaigns or parties. We believe that informed voters are the backbone of democracy. We register citizens to vote, study issues of public interest, share our findings publicly, and advocate for policy change. We also sponsor public forums such as this event this evening. Rochester People's Climate Coalition is an inclusive, nonpartisan network of organizations and individuals unified by their determination to identify and implement effective climate solutions. Their diverse supporters include business, faith, civic, labor, and environmental groups, of which the League of Women Voters is one. Before we continue, I must tell you that unfortunately, Mayor Lovely Warren's health challenges have prevented her from participating tonight. We have offered to reschedule next week, and her campaign spokesperson has declined. She expressed agreement that we proceed, and we offer our best wishes for her recovery. Our timekeeper this evening is League member and Assistant Director of RIT's Center for Leadership and Civic Engagement, Phyllis Walker. League member Elaine Schmidt will be recording the debate, and you'll soon find a link posted on our website and that of RPCC. We invite you to access that recording instead of making others and use it in its entirety. No clips, please. Our moderator this evening is Shirley Stevens Thompson. Shirley is a 41-year resident of Rochester, a racial and social justice community activist, a student of nonviolence, and is always seeking ways to make our community the best it can be for all people. Without further ado, please welcome Shirley, and let's begin.
Thank you, Mary. And thank you to the candidates and the audience members who are joining us this evening. Before I introduce the candidates, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items and explain the format for tonight's forum. Please take a moment now to turn off your cell phones. A lot of you, yeah. Thank you. Also, as Mary said, the League is going to provide the entire video of the forum on its website, which can be found at lwv-rma.org. lwv-rma.org. So please do not attempt to record this event. Bathrooms are out the door here. Just make a left and keep going to your left. And if we need to leave in an emergency, there's a beautiful garden out here on the right, but I'm not sure if that's the real exit, so you might want to leave this way. It is my pleasure to introduce the Democratic candidates for mayor. Rachel Barnhart is familiar to the community as an investigative and public interest journalist for Time Warner Cable, 13 Wham News, and WROC TV8 during her 18-year career. She's a graduate of John Marshall High School and Cornell University. James Shepard is the former chief of the Rochester Police Department and currently serves as a Monroe County legislator. He serves on several area nonprofit boards, including Ibero-American Action League, Bivona, NAMI, which is the National Association of Mental Illness, and Prevention First. He's a graduate of SUNY's Empire State College and the FBI National Academy. Thank you both for being here. Candidates drew numbers to determine the order in which they'll make their opening statements in response to the first question. After that, the order of response will alternate between them. The candidates have been informed that they will have the opportunity to ask the last question of the evening of their opponent. So they'll get to ask each other a question. Each candidate will have 3 minutes to make an opening statement response to the question. Did I get the thumbs up from Ryan?
Go ahead. And click again.
Okay. They'll have 3 minutes to make an opening statement response to this question that's projected on the screen. It's in 3 screens, so we'll move through it in a moment. After that, they'll have 1 minute to respond to subsequent questions. If one candidate refers to the other in their response, their opponent will have 30 seconds to rebut. Just 1 rebuttal per question. And if the candidate chooses to rebut, before you begin your 30-second rebuttal, please say rebut so that the timekeeper, Phyllis here, will know how to hit the clock.
Where's the timer?
Right here. When we reach the point where the candidates ask a question of the other, they'll be allotted no more than 30 seconds to frame that question, not make a long speech leading up to it. And their opponent will have 1 minute to respond. And finally, at the end of the evening, each candidate will have an opportunity to make a 1-minute closing statement. If you'd like a piece of paper or an index card to write your question, please raise your hand. Or if you have a question ready to hand in, please raise your hand so that it can be picked up. Okay, we're going to start now with the opening statement prompt. The City of Rochester's Climate Action Plan calls for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the 2010 levels by 2020 and 40% reduction by 2030. Though this is in line with the emissions reduction targets set by many of the cities, it falls short of where science says we need to be to avoid catastrophic global warming. At least 30 cities around the U.S., including Atlanta, Salt Lake City, and San Diego, have adopted ambitious 100% clean energy goals. And 5 cities in the U.S., including those you see there, Aspen, Colorado, Burlington, Vermont, Greensburg, Kansas, Kodiak, Alaska, and Rockport, Missouri, have fully transitioned to 100% renewable energy to power their electricity needs. Most remarkably, Los Angeles has committed to achieving carbon neutrality across all sectors by 2025 through a World War II scale climate mobilization. If you are Rochester's next mayor, what % reduction in gas house and GHG emissions from the 2010 levels can we expect by the end of your 4-year term? And what are the primary strategies you will use to achieve that reduction? Ms. Barnhart, pick number 1, and she will go first.
Thank you so much, Shirley, and thank you everyone for being here. I'd especially like to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting this event tonight, along with the Rochester People's Climate Coalition. This wasn't supposed to be the only event hosted by the League of Women Voters. I just want to talk about something that has happened today. We know that Mayor Lovely Warren has declined to participate in a televised mayoral debate. That is so sad and anti-democratic and breaks decades of tradition. The League of Women Voters today extended an invitation to me and James Shepard to participate in a debate at Channel 8 next week. He declined. But he went further than that. He said I was not a legitimate candidate because I had no record. This is everything wrong with our local Democratic Party. Jim Shepard doesn't get to decide who has a record and who you should be able to hear from. He thinks you should only be able to hear from him. I will not be silenced in this campaign. It is part of democracy to take part in a televised debate. I have a record. I had nearly 2 decades of being on the front lines, giving a voice to the voiceless, fighting for our community, and holding politicians like Jim Shepard and Lovely Warren accountable. This week, you have seen Lovely Warren and Jim Shepard spit on democracy, and it is shameful. the only candidate in this campaign who is focused on transit and sprawl. Our community has paid such a heavy price because we have allowed people to leave and take resources with them. There has been a tremendous environmental, social, and economic cost. The city of Rochester alone has lost 30,000 jobs between 2000 and 2014 to the suburbs. This has a huge impact on transit, on vehicle miles traveled, on our air quality, on our land use. And tonight I hope to talk a lot more about strategies that we can use to cut greenhouse gas emissions through aggressive policies to reduce vehicle miles traveled. I do think we can set more aggressive standards in our community. Thank you.
And I repeat, if a candidate chooses to rebut, please state rebut at the beginning of your statement.
I too would like to thank you for inviting us here to have this conversation relative to climate. And I have to be honest with you, there was a time when I had no understanding in terms of the impact of the things that we did as human beings had on this planet. You know, the recent storms that we've had, we go back to Katrina, we can go to Sandy, we can go to Harvey down in Texas. We see that the impact of what we have done has been tremendous in terms of some of these devastating weather events. I also know that we, as a small community, have to take aggressive action to do some things to change what we know is going to occur. At the national level, our president has determined that we will not be involved in the Paris Accords, where every other nation, with the exception of two, Syria and Nicaragua, have signed off. And so it's important for us, not just as the city of Rochester, but as the county of Monroe, the state of New York, and individual governmental bodies stand up and take a position to make a difference. In terms of my position, how much we will reduce our carbon emissions, our carbon footprint, in 2026, I would like for it to be by 50%. Thank you.
Thank you both. We'll have our first question now from the audience. Historically, the poor and people of color have borne the greatest burden of pollution exposure and blighted neighborhoods. How will you use climate policy to address this historic injustice? Mr. Shepherd, you have the first 60 seconds.
Environmental justice is increasingly being recognized as a critical component in creating a more equitable, prosperous society. Because what we know, the people who are most seriously impacted are the poor, relative to whatever decisions we make. One of the things that I hear is that we should put certain taxes, whether it's on gas, vehicles, other means of transportation, but the end result of that will be the people who can least afford it are the ones who will be most negatively impacted. And so within my platform, I have values and principles. Environmental burdens that are overwhelmingly borne by the poorest Americans and therefore they're disproportionately borne by minority communities, we will have a justice principle platform.
Thank you. Ms. Barnhart.
One need only go into many of our poorer neighborhoods and see that they simply don't have the same infrastructure as wealthier neighborhoods. They have fewer trees. You can look on Google Earth and zoom into some of our city streets that are less affluent and see they have less tree cover. They have fewer infrastructure for pedestrians and bicyclists. The City of Rochester needs to make sure that we have a transit equity policy, that we continue to add bike lanes, we continue to add sidewalks. We also need to have a policy to enforce traffic safety. We have neighborhoods where a third of residents don't have vehicles. I am proposing that we have a Vision Zero traffic plan, which takes in the built environment, an educational component, as well as enforcement. This entire process of making sure that our neighborhoods have transit equity will go a long way into making sure that our neighborhoods don't bear the burden of environmental problems.
Thank you. We have one microphone
Oh, I'm
for
so
both
sorry.
candidates to use, and
I'm
so
sorry.
it'll be necessary for you both to speak into it so that everyone in the back can hear you. The next question is from the Rochester Youth Climate Leaders. What are your highest priorities in the Climate Action Plan? Are there other ideas you have that are not part of the Climate Action Plan? And Ms. Barnhart? Yes.
Well, we need to get more people out of their cars and onto transit. And to do that, we need to have a city-first economic development policy. This is directly related to climate. We have to have a regional planning focus that puts the city first in terms of job location. In the last 2 weeks, we've had 2 job announcements about companies locating in Henrietta. This hurts the city. It hurts our tax base, it hurts roads, it hurts the air quality, and it hurts residents who don't have access to these jobs. Our system is not set up to serve places in Henrietta. We must work with Empire State Development and COMETA to make sure that we are incentivizing locating jobs near where people live. That would be my #1 priority.
And my #1 priority would be to have a Greater Rochester Climate Summit within the first 6 months of my administration, where we bring together all of the stakeholders. That includes business, other governmental entities, neighborhoods, neighbors, concerned citizens, to come together for us to outline how we're going to proceed in the future. I think also in terms of empowerment, because it's not a matter of just city government pushing down and dictating what we are going to do. It has to be a collaborative effort where we all work together to make change. As I said before, if it's only the government, then nothing will change. But it's something where we work together within the neighborhoods, within the community organizations, with those that are concerned with climate, we can make a difference.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue into the next question, which you will respond to first, Mr. Shepherd. Implementing the city's climate action plan will require cooperation from many non-governmental stakeholders. How will you motivate participation from outside agencies, businesses, and landlords?
When we talk about empowerment, that means that you bring all these entities to the table and outline what we're trying to accomplish with short and long-term goals. And in terms of some of our businesses within the city, we already give tax breaks relative to building and development. We have to encourage them to take advantage of different technologies to reduce their carbon footprint. And then they build, we have to build in certain requirements that for new buildings, they're built in a way so that the carbon footprint is lessened. So whether it's glass, whether it's what they put on the roofs, whether it's the way that the wind or the air is circulated within a building, so you have to use less air conditioning and at the same time less heat. Those are some of the things that we can encourage our businesses to do. And again, like I said, by bringing a summit together that involves not just big business, but small business and individual community members, we can have a platform, a strategy that will actually work and benefit this city.
Well, communication is going to be key. We have a number of programs now that incentivize energy upgrades for both homes and for businesses. We have programs that incentivize shared solar, that incentivize getting solar panels on your home. That how many people know about these programs? Not many. Or they're afraid it's too expensive or it's something that they can't access. We're going to have to launch an aggressive marketing campaign to make sure that people are aware of the options. And we can do that in a number of different ways. Certainly working with neighborhood groups and business groups would be a top priority.
Thank you. The next question. Would you support an ordinance that required energy efficiency standards in rental housing and tied the certificate of occupancy renewal process to the implementation of these standards? And our first respondent is Ms. Barnhart.
I I would, after we do a feasibility study and get input from all stakeholders to make sure that what we're doing is financially responsible and to make sure that it would have the impact that we want. So I think this is a wonderful goal and something that we should absolutely work towards, but first we have to do a feasibility study on what it would look like, what it would cost, is there buy-in, how would we get buy-in, and what would be the measurable outcome. So the answer is yes, but we're going to have to do some work first.
Would that be yes on both counts? An ordinance that required it and tied it to the...
Yeah, oh yes, yes.
Okay.
And I too would say yes on both accounts. I think it will be important for us to look at energy efficiencies the same way we looked at addressing the lead paint concerns in this community, in which all the stakeholders, whether it's county, city, the landlords, the builders, were involved in the process so that we were able to build energy efficient living spaces that were part of the certificate of occupancy. We also have to explore how are we going to fund it. And I think that in terms of grants, whether they come from the federal government, state government, or city government, would also be very important to implement and to explore. And then I also think in terms of other opportunities for us to fund these so that in the future, as we build newer apartments and living spaces, that they do meet the city standard.
Again, from the Rochester Youth Climate Leaders, the success of community choice aggregation is directly dependent upon the number of participants in terms of cutting carbon emissions and minimizing costs to the consumer. How would you increase public awareness of the CCA, Community Choice Aggregation Program, so as to increase its effectiveness? And Mr. Shepherd?
As was previously mentioned, I think it's very much important to how we communicate what we'd like to do. And from the city government, there are any number of mailings that we send out with your bills, with what the city's up to, and we make it an important part of what we send out to communicate what we're trying to accomplish, what we'd like to do in terms of each individual's responsibility to make it happen. Education is obviously the key, and I think that what we also need to do is within the schools, have a program that is part of the STEM education process, science, technology, engineering, and math, in which our young adults are exposed to the benefits of reducing our carbon footprint as well.
I was very pleased to see the city begin to commit to community choice aggregation and study how we might accomplish this. I envision community choice aggregation as being something that the entire city does, that we would have our own network. And I think this could really put Rochester on the map. We could be a place that we could advertise to other communities and say, if you want green energy, Rochester is the place to locate. This is something that would be terrific. We don't think it would save a lot of money for consumers. There are a couple of communities doing this in New York State, but that's not the point. The point is that you can feel good about where you're getting your energy from, but I envision it as being something the whole city would do.
What ideas, and the first respondent will be Ms. Barnhart, what ideas do you have for bringing Monroe County along so that it openly acknowledges the challenges facing us due to climate change? That's one question. And the second part is, how can we encourage county government to create a county-wide cap? I want folks to bear in mind they have 1 minute to answer the questions. So you might want to write your questions on 2 separate pieces of index card.
Sure. I think it's imperative that the city work with the county on transit and economic development. And certainly discussions on a cap can be part of that, but I think it's so important that we make sure that when we're doing regional planning decisions, whether it's land use, whether it's incentivizing jobs, whether it's transit, we have got to make sure that we have a city-first policy. We have got to make sure that jobs are located on transit lines near where people live. That is going to be a really difficult conversation to have with the county. We also have to have it with New York State. It's my understanding that the Western New York Economic Development Council does put Buffalo's needs ahead of the surrounding area. We need to to look at that too as part of the Finger Lakes Economic Development Council. Those conversations will be really difficult, but I'm a fighter and I'm not afraid to have them. And I think the county would be willing to work with us on that. I mean, look, we had the Moore and Ryan agreement, which was a landmark agreement, recognizing that the city has unique needs. It's time for another one, this time focused on regional planning.
And in the Shepherd administration, we established a climate control council for the greater Rochester area. So it's not just about the city of Rochester, it's about the entirety of Monroe County. And they will help monitor the day-to-day progress as we move forward relative to reducing our carbon footprint. We will also organize a green business roundtable. We're together sitting down with our business leaders, the ones who are most likely to have a large carbon footprint, to discuss and put in place strategies to reduce our carbon footprint and how to further advance our efforts for green energy.
The Rochester Youth Climate Leaders, you're busy this evening. There's a shortage of trained individuals for climate-friendly jobs, for example, solar installation. What can city government do to support retraining of fossil fuel-based employees to sustainability-based jobs? Mr. Shepherd.
As I mentioned earlier, in terms of youth, I do believe that we need to have educational opportunities that teach STEM related to climate and climate control. I also think for older adults, we have OASIS, the Office of Adult and Career Educational Services, which is part of the Rochester City School District. It does take adults and provide them with opportunities to gain training in a number of fields. And I think in terms of transitioning from fossil fuels to green energy would be a wonderful program for them to initiate to help individuals who are trying to transition into that field.
Rochester should be much farther along when it comes to green jobs than we are. And I think the best way to get people trained for green jobs is to get the jobs here, get companies invested in our community. Eastman Business Park presents such an opportunity, and particularly when it comes to materials science, for solar panels, for chemicals. And it really hasn't lived up to what is possible. I was very disappointed when Solar City went to Buffalo, when we have all of this infrastructure in Rochester to support green jobs. What we need to do is make sure that between the city, the state, the county, and Eastman Business Park and other assets that we have, that we are doing our best to market our region as a place where you want to locate those kinds of factories, those kinds of jobs, and those kinds of research facilities. We're not there yet, and I think it's something that we should really be fighting for.
Next question is, how does emergency preparedness factor into your platform on climate change? Ms. Barnhart?
Sure. It is vital that the city of Rochester have an emergency preparedness plan, whether we're talking about climate change or we're talking about a major snowstorm. It is not apparent to me after this last windstorm and snowstorm that followed that we had such a plan. We had a windstorm that knocked out power to people for days in the city of Rochester. We didn't hear much from our local leaders. I took a team of our volunteers into the Josana neighborhood to knock on doors and check on the vulnerable. No one had checked on them. They were living without heat in sub-zero wind chills. The corner stores were closed. There was nowhere to get food because they had no power. To me, that was an indication that something went wrong. And so the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that when we have an event like this, that we're checking on people, that we have a plan to ensure that there's a place for people to go, that people who need to go are there. And we just didn't see that back in March.
In terms of emergency preparedness, what the city of Rochester, the county of Monroe, the state of New York, all have in place is the incident and command system. And what makes that actually work is that if you actually prepare and drill for those types of emergencies. And it's not imperative that you plan for climate or weather factors, but for any type of emergency, you use the incident command system to ensure that you respond appropriately. I also think it's important that we empower our community members. The civilian emergency response team, which is part of the city government, part of our fire department, their role is in each community, each neighborhood, to have a CERT, Community Emergency Response Team, that will do those duties in terms of checking on individuals in their homes that may be negatively impacted by the events that have occurred.
Thank you both. Now that you've gotten good and comfortable, Phyllis, could I ask you to move to that seat there so that I can see you? This
Oh,
screen
you
is
got
blocking
that.
you.
Okay, I'll move.
The next question, which Mr. Shepherd will respond to first, please. Climate change is the existential crisis of our lifetime. How do you intend to bring in the financial resources we need to adequately tackle climate mitigation and adaptation in our city?
I think in terms of bringing in the resources, anything that involves a budget requires priorities. And if addressing climate change and ensuring that the city of Rochester is doing everything it can to move to green energy, we have to make that a priority in our budget process. Whether we have electric cars, whether we have buses that run on natural gas, whether we have more bicycle lanes, whether we encourage people to walk as opposed to drive, or carpool instead of individual driving, we have to do everything within our power to make sure that we're taking the steps to encourage people to reduce our carbon footprint. At the end of the day, it's about putting your money where your mouth is, and not just talking about it, but actually taking the steps to make sure these things occur, and doing the things, the sacrifices that must be made, so that if you put money into this, the sacrifices and the things that you do not do, because that is your priority.
A lot of upgrades end up paying for themselves, which is why we do them. And there are creative ways to finance energy upgrades, such as the PACE system, where if a business wants to do an energy upgrade, they can have a fee tacked on to their property tax bill. That's something that Rochester could buy into.